if needed, to organize people and resources. So if you're putting people into groups, you may want to do that first, because once you've given the instructions, which is the second part, you want it to be as recent as possible so that people haven't forgotten what you want them to do. Doing it the other way around, saying, hey, you're first going to do this, then this, then this. Okay, now everyone get into groups and go get the post-it notes. By the time they've got all those things and settled, different groups are going to be starting at different times. Some people will ask, what are we going to do? What are we doing? I've forgotten. So doing it the other way around really helps to just get people ready. Once they're ready, organized, I should say, then you give them the instructions.
Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hey Ped, how are you doing?
I'm good, Andrea. How are you?
Very good, very good. Thank you for being back. It's great to see you again. You've just a few days last week, you've delivered a web class for the students of our academy, and so that's a great opportunity to talk about some of the things that we covered last week in in a one-to-one conversation. And
Yes.
Ped, for those who just know the title of this episode, which is going to be something along the lines of the art of facilitation. So we will be talking about how to facilitate, how to run and lead meetings, workshops, training courses. Can you tell them the reason why they should stay around and listen? What will they get from this conversation?
Yeah. What will they get? I I've been facilitating for about 24 years now in some shape or form, designing learning. Way before facilitation was a buzzword that you hear all the time. There's so many different things that I come across now about what facilitating is and isn't. And so what I'd love to share is my 24 years of designing and facilitating all sorts of experience, from outdoor education to corporate training and innovation processes and everything in between. So I'd love to share the wisdoms that I've gleaned along the way.
Perfect. Let's do it. And now in those 25 years, I don't know if that's within the 25 years or before that. I know, and we talked about it last week, I know that you are a next theoretical physicist, and I told you
Yes.
I'm very interested in physics, in particular astrophysics. I follow people like Brian Greene, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox in the UK. Tell me a little bit about your journey from theoretical physicist to what you do now, facilitation and these kind of things?
So it's not a smooth journey, I'd say, but it started off with me wanting to study physics because I'd love to figure out how the universe worked. I remember when I went to university, uh, I filled out the application form in the UK. It's called the UCAS application, and I had a quote. It's from a Roman philosopher. I think I'm probably going to get this wrong because it's so long ago, but it's called Virgil, and he had a quote which was something like, "Lucky is he who understands the causes of things," and that was like a big driving force for me wanting to study physics. And in a clunky way, to make a link between that and what I do now, facilitating uh, and and designing learning and all those things, really, I got curious and fascinated about how people collaborate, coordinate, learn, grow. And I've really taken the same geeky approach of science-based, evidence-based uh, geekery to figure out what's the best way to construct a facilitated journey, what's the best way to get the most out of people, what's the neuroscience or the psychology of how these things fit together. And I say this now just more from a reflecting back on my journey, but there's definitely that sciencey, geeky part of me that still lives on. And even when it comes to the world of, say, coaching and facilitating, there's a lot of kind of woo-woo things out there and using your intuition and all that stuff. But when you look into that stuff and you look at the third brain or the second brain and inside your, the nerves that go into your stomach and your heart and all that stuff, there's things to draw out, which over the years I've enjoyed learning about and incorporating in my practice.
Ped, we are 100% aligned, and I love the approach. Also, for me, you talk about the art and science of facilitation. I talk about the art and science of presenting, public speaking, because from a presentation perspective, I think that a good presentation is a bit of a mix of art and science. So I'm glad to see that you come to these from a similar with a similar approach, from a similar perspective. And I want to make sure that everyone here, our listeners, are aligned and clear about what we are talking about, because normally we talk about they know me for things like presentations, public speaking. Here we're talking about facilitation, facilitating training courses, workshops, meetings. What is facilitation?
There's You can Google it, obviously. The way I see facilitating, it is about guiding a group of people towards a goal. And there are different ways, there are different contexts in which we facilitate. And the way I break it down, there's three kind of buckets of how three buckets of guiding people towards a goal. The first one is around helping people develop skills for themselves and doing that in a group setting. Now, there's a little bit of an overlap with training, so teaching something and having people uh, uh, develop their new behaviors and skills. Yet, I still think that the facilitation mindset is really helpful in helping people helping to guide people towards that skill acquisition. So it's about presenting an idea, having them practice the skills, and then facilitating the conversation around what that means for them and their reality. So that's the first bucket, individual skills. There's also group processes. So helping a group of people who typically work with each other, a team, a department, an organization, etc., to figure out how to more skillfully work with each other. So how to navigate conflict, how to make decisions, etc. Also, within that, you can think about how organizations might change. Maybe you're bringing, maybe there's a merger and you're bringing two teams together and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's happened before? What do we want to honor about that? What do we want to grieve and let go of? And how do we want to move forward? So group processes is the second bucket. And the third bucket, which is probably the thing that's popularizing facilitation in the last few years, it's the innovation processes. So design thinking, service design, design sprints, these things which are more about capturing the collective wisdom of a group of people so that they can create something new together. And so that's how I see facilitating. It's the same thing, guiding a group of people towards a common goal, but there are different flavors of it.
Yep. Okay, so we want to guide a group of people towards a goal, and we want to design an experience, a workshop, a training course, whatever, a meeting, whatever the context is. What's the first step? What's the first step in designing an effective workshop?
You probably have this when you're thinking about your speaking. Start with the end in mind, thinking about what do these people want to do in their work or their lives, so that the context is 100% the most important thing to start off with. Because even if you are running the same session for a different group of people, understanding their context, their goals, their aspirations, the things that aren't working as well for them, that helps you to decide what it is that you want to focus on in the session, but also frame the session in a way that is meaningful to the people, so they know exactly what they're going to get out of it and why it's important to them. So yeah, the context, understanding context is a first step. And where they want to go is a second step. That's related to the first one, because that in a way is the bookmark of where they are right now and where they want to go. Design the session is the next bit.
To make that happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that understanding the context and making sure that we are very clear about where they are now, where they need to go, so that we can guide them towards their goal. Now, not doing that is, I assume, a mistake. What other mistakes do you see when it comes to running meetings, workshops, training courses?
Where do I begin? And these are mistakes that I've made as well, by the way. So when I say this, it's not about saying, oh, people don't do this. And some people, including myself, might make one mistake but not the other. So the few mistakes I see is getting excited about an experience that you've had in the past and certain tools that you've come across that meant something for you, and thinking, let's do it to other people. This was such a life-changing experience when I did this particular activity, and then trying to do that for others and then it falling flat. Because probably didn't get the context properly, didn't properly address the context in advance. And so that tool might have been the wrong one. Another mistake that I see is what I call winging it, or just using your intuition too much, or well, let me just take that one step back, because actually using your intuition is a really useful thing within a session when you're facilitating, because you can figure out whether you're on track or off track. It's a data point, but there are times when using your intuition works. There are times when being enthusiastic works. There are times when just being good with people works. These things are really useful skills, but they're not the thing to rely on to consistently get good workshop results. And I know that when we start out, especially, there is that enthusiasm, there is the just feeling it out, and we can sometimes get away with it. And that ends up, if we end up doing that too much, it's the wrong lesson to learn from it, that it's always going to work out this way. And yeah, so those are two main ones. A third one that I come across as well is taking a bit, I call it taking a transactional approach, just thinking, here's what these people need to do. I've got the right tool, so we're just going to give it to them, and we're going to do this activity, versus really thinking about, well, what's the transformation that they want in their work or their lives, and picking activities that support that transformation. And again, this is really, we'll probably talk about this a little bit later when it comes to taking a storytelling approach to designing a workshop experience. The difference between being transactional and transformational is that being transactional feels like you're just doing a chore, but being transformational in your approach to facilitating is like more like taking people on a journey.
Let's talk about it now. We want to go from transactional to transformational, and you said now that there's a storytelling approach that will allow us to do that. Now, last week at the web class, you talked about, if tell me if I captured them correctly. If not, please correct me. But you went through a few steps, if you want, in terms of this storytelling approach, and I'm going to list them one at a time, and it would be great if we could have a conversation on each of these steps. So I remember setup. So we've got the setup, and then you mentioned there has to be an inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Did I capture it correctly? All of that? Okay,
you did.
perfect.
Yeah, you did.
Let's get started. Setup.
Okay. So the setup. Well, any story has a setup. This is also known as the exposition in a story. And this is where you're introducing the background, the characters, etc. So that's what happens in a story. So in a workshop, the setup is you're setting the context. The characters are the participants in the workshop. So you're using the context that we talked about earlier to go, here's what we're going to be covering. This is why it's important to what you're up to in your work or your lives. So that's basically just telling people what's happening. It's setting the context.
Okay, perfect. And I was really curious about this inciting incident. What do you mean
Yeah.
by that?
So the inciting incident in a story, then it's where it's the triggering event where the rest of the story sets the rest of the story in motion, right? So it's the in a workshop, it will be more tantamount to having the participants feel the context. So whereas a setup is you telling them what the context is, the inciting incident is about them feeling the context. And a way I like to think about this is that we are taking the participants and we're dipping them very briefly in the whole context of a workshop. So the example I used last time, and I'll use here again, is let's say you're doing a workshop around creativity. So an inciting incident might be doing a quick activity where you get people to draw as many circles with unique things in the middle in 1 minute. And it's active, it's experiential, and at the end of it, you can have a conversation about what that was like. And really, depending on what you're going to cover for the rest of the workshop, start to draw out some of the key learning points that you ultimately want people to capture as you go along. So you're, in a way, setting in motion, like I said, what's going to happen later. And it's still part of the context. So setup and inciting incident, I still see as being part of the context that gets everyone essentially ready for the journey you're taking them on.
And you used a key word, which was experiential. Why is this important? Why do we need to make it experiential?
It's how we learn best, right? There's obviously a role, and there's in the space of learning that's more about telling, absorbing information, but really when it comes to facilitating, it's not a lecture, it's not a talk. All these things are useful, but when it comes to facilitating, I see this as a valuable opportunity for helping people learn by doing, because in everyday life we're doing things, and whether we intentionally or unintentionally realize it, we are learning in the process. So we can talk about how other parts of the facilitated journey can create a much more intentional space for people to reflect on the learning, but the experience is a thing that really gets people to have reactions, thoughts, feelings, all come up, which gives you all the useful information to guide people towards their aha moments.
Yeah, we learn by doing. Okay, so we've got the context, which is the setup and the inciting incident. Then we get to the rising action. Tell me more.
Again, in a story, this is the successive plot developments, the twists, the turns, etc. In the workshop, I see this as the things that we do as facilitators, but mostly things that the participants do through the activities, through the experiences that we've designed. So the example I would use for the creativity workshop is you might share creativity principles. You might do some certain activities that uncover conditions that support creativity or hinder creativity. You might do some creative exercises, some ideation methods. So there are different things that you might do, or the participants might do, that guide them towards the climax.
Okay, so and then we get to the climax. In the context of a workshop, what are we talking about?
It's where everything comes together. So the climax, if designed well, is another activity. It is something that relates very strongly to the ultimate goal that the participants want in their work or their life. So that context becomes really important again. We want to make sure that it's something that both brings together everything that we've done, but also helps them. It also gives them the thing that they need after the workshop.
And as you explain these things, and it happened last week as well with your web class, I'm constantly thinking about, okay,
Yeah.
am I doing this? Is because I'm doing that thing. Is that what Ped considers a climax? Okay, we get to the climax, and then because I thought, okay, climax, that's the end. No, that's not the end. We've got a falling action.
Yeah. So falling action in a story is where you start to wrap up loose ends. And how I see this in the workshop is it's the integrating part of the workshop. So this is where we have that structured reflection on the experience, what that was like, what they learned, any insights, and very specifically, what are they now going to do about those insights beyond the workshop? So, whereas the climax was about giving them the experience or culminating the experience, the falling action is more about making sense of it, so that it's people have had a chance to really reflect on what they're going to do, because you don't want to leave it to chance. Oftentimes, this is a thing that can get compressed, especially if some activities go a little bit longer, which leads us to think about how we design things so that we're giving enough time for things and we're not trying to cram out our workshops too much. Less is more is definitely a good principle to hold. But yeah, so it's really about making sure that people are taking something useful out of the experience.
Okay, perfect. And again, in your storytelling approach, you say that's also not the end because then we've got the final step, which is the resolution.
Yeah. The resolutions is just it's finishing the story. So it's the ultimate so what? It's the okay, now that we've figured out this is what we're going to do, let's just wrap it up. And either the story ends there or you're teeing up the sequel. So maybe there's another workshop in the series and you're uh, you're offering a teaser about what's going to happen and how what's happened in this workshop is going to relate to the next one.
Understood. Perfect. Okay, so for our listeners, storytelling approach, setup, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution.
Yeah.
Now, in the same
Actually,
way,
before
Pat,
before we go on, there doesn't have to be another workshop next to have a what happens next, by the way. So I'll just share this very briefly. Um, in terms of a mistake that I see happen is you have a great experience in a workshop and there's no follow through. So there's got to be some conversation about what happens next, accountability, a mini action plan, whatever it might be, whether it's on an individual basis or as a group basis. If I'm working with a group, I'd say, okay, so what are you going to do about this next? Are you going to have another team meeting about it? Are you going to, who's going to write it up? Who's going to make sure X, Y, or Z things happen? So it's really the resolution is about making sure that things happen afterwards as well.
yeah, and we've got that commitment from
Yeah.
participants, and this is also very much aligned to how we approach presenting, Pat, because even a presentation, many people think that the objective of a presentation is just to share some information. And that's not the case. If you just want to share information, that's fine, but there's no need to give I'm talking about an oral presentation when you're
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
it
yeah,
could
yeah.
be in person or online. You give a presentation because you want often you want the audience to do something after the
Hmm.
presentation. And this, I see it's very similar.
Hmm.
We are facilitating that experience because we want the audience to do something as a result of it. Okay. Now, last week, you also went through a structure that you call Spark. Spark, like Spark, but with double P.
Yeah.
SPPARK. Spark with double P. And again, let's do the same thing. We're going to go through each of the elements of your
Yeah.
Spark framework one at a time. The first one is setting the scene. That's the S. Then we've got two P's, present information and provide guidance.
Mhm.
Then we have activating the experience, reflecting on the experience, and then you finish with the key points that you want to land. Have I summarized that
That's
correctly?
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So let's go. The first step is setting the scene.
Yeah. So setting the scene sounds very similar to the setting the scene, which I just talked about. And I think it's probably worth mentioning that the storytelling approach is about how you think about running, how you think about designing an entire workshop. And the Spark framework, which we're talking about now, is more about how you run a specific activity. Now, there's overlap for sure. When it comes to setting the scene in the activity, this is about sharing the what, the how, and the why, right? So, what are you doing? You just basically, it could be as simple as saying the name of the activity. We're going to do this activity. Why you're doing it. Well, it's related to what they want to achieve, or it's related to where they are on the story. You can say, we've just done this. We're about to, we want to go and do this. And in the meantime, we need to make sure that we clarify this particular thing so that we can do that thing. So that's the why. And the how in the setup is more about giving people an overview of what the activity is going to be about. It's not giving any instructions at this stage. And I find that doing the what, why, and the how in this way gives people enough information for them to just feel comfortable about what's going to happen. Um, an example, if it's helpful.
Please, yeah.
The one example I like to use with this is, let's say you're doing a a, a values workshop for emerging leaders. The what is, you'll say, we're about to do a values mining exercise. That's it, right? That's what we're doing. Why we're doing it. We're doing this because when it comes to making decisions from a place of meaning, so that we're more effective, we need to know what our core values are so that we can relate to that when making our decisions. The how. We're going to do this by sharing short stories about what makes us tick, and we'll help each other reflect on what our values are. So those three things can easily just help people understand what's going to happen and why.
Okay, perfect. We set the scene and then we present information. I'm interested here because I would have said, okay, first we present information and then we tell them what we're going to do. But you say, no, first you set the scene and then you present information. Tell me more.
The information that I'm referring to here is more about any big idea, any concepts, or depending on the activity, having people recall any prior information that they need in order to do the activity. And you don't always need this. So with the values mining workshop, or with the values workshop, before you start doing some values mining, you may want to explain what values are. So values are blah, blah, blah. You might also want to explain what we mean by mining. So what we mean by mining is we're going to uncover what these core values are, whatever it is, right? So it's just about making sure that they have the information to then do the activity.
Before we continue with this episode, I just want to share a few resources that I think will be super useful for you. The first one is check out either my book, Confident Presenter, or my colleague Phil Wakenall's book, Business Presentation Revolution, or both. These are books for business owners and leaders who want to take their presentation skills to a higher level. To make the most of the books, take the Confident Presenter Scorecard, which is an online tool that allows you to assess your presentation skills for free in less than 3 minutes. And then also, at the moment, I'm running a series of free presentation skills web classes, and I'd love to see you there. The links are in the show notes. Now let's go back to the episode. Okay, understood. And then after that, we provide guidance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I break this down into two parts. The first is, if needed, to organize people and resources. So if you're putting people into groups, you may want to do that first, because once you've given the instructions, which is the second part, you want it to be as recent as possible so that people haven't forgotten what you want them to do. Doing it the other way around, saying, hey, you're first going to do this, then this, then this. Okay, now everyone get into groups and go get the post-it notes. By the time they've got all those things and settled, different groups are going to be starting at different times. Some people will ask, what are we going to do? what are we doing? I've forgotten. So doing it the other way around really helps to just get people ready. Once they're ready, organized, I should say, then you give them the instructions. And okay. Yeah, that's
okay. So first we organize them. We organize the groups of the resources, whatever the context requires, and then we give instructions, and then we activate the experience. So I guess that's about making sure that the activity happens.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Have them have the experience. There's nothing complicated about that. The only advice I would give is being mindful around how long people have got to do certain things. I have like a 20-minute rule for most things when it comes to workshops, and not doing anything for more than 20 minutes at a time. So if there's a long activity, thinking about breaking it up, having a checkpoint, seeing how people are doing, giving some guidance, feedback, etc.
On that point, do you when you think about the duration of an activity, you said maximum 20 minutes, and I agree. We do the same. But do you differentiate between in-person workshops and online, or it doesn't make any difference for you from a duration?
I'd say I'd say 20 minutes online or offline. It's just good practice. And I mean, there's I've got 6 different types of activity formats that you can like mix and match, that helps to just create a sense of diversity of experience as well as keeping pace. And we could talk about that.
That's interesting. I would like to just explore these in a little bit more detail. So it's not enough to make sure that we create that we include activities for people to actually do something as part of the experience, but what you said is that it's also important to mix them up, to have different types of activities. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, there's a few different ways that you can think about this. So I'll start off with the 6 different activity formats. And then I'll share 2 other things after that, and I'll make this brief. But in terms of activities, I think about things as individual, anything that you're doing where you have people reflect on things individually. So individual reflection. There's group discussion or paired discussion. There's active experimentation is another one that I have a category around, and you could do that individually or you could do that in groups, but basically you're kind of doing something. You've got a worksheet, you're doing a particular task, different from a discussion, which is, here are some prompt questions for you to discuss. Then there is kind of debrief Q&A type stuff. Talks is I put talks or mini teachers as part of the formats, and scenarios is the other one, like creating scenarios for people to think through. Again, they could do this individually or in groups. And then the other thing I would say really briefly about this as well is thinking about how we balance activities so that we can do things which are, say, low energy to high energy, instead of doing high energy, high energy, high energy, or low, 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 or playful and serious. There's loads of different ways that you could just balance activities. And then finally, I'd say, as well as thinking through, especially group processes, whether we're doing divergent or convergent processes. So you don't want to keep making things divergent and just more brainstorming, more brainstorming, more brainstorming until you've just got this big list of things and people are really overwhelmed by what they're doing, and making sure that we're all also bringing things to a kind of a point. So we've gone wide, now we're going to narrow down. And so these are different ways that I would think about the experience, so that we can, every 20 minutes we're making sure that we're taking into account some of these things.
Can you help me understand this difference between divergent activities and convergent ones?
So just very briefly, let's say you're going back to that creativity example. So a divergent activity could be list out all the challenges that you see trying to achieve this particular thing that we're trying to do as a team. So suddenly you've got all of these ideas. And a convergent activity would be, let's prioritize the top 3 challenges, and then bringing it back to something a bit more specific.
Understood. Okay, that's clear. Okay, now going back to the Spark structure, we were talking about activating the experience. Then after that, we want them to reflect on the experience. Anything to...
Yeah, so this goes back to, it's the same kind of idea about what we talked about in that integration part of the storytelling process. And here, the only thing I would add is making sure that it's a structured process. So you could do this, and then we talked about the 3 kind of questions. What was that like? What insights or learnings you have, and how you're going to apply it. So you could either do this by asking people individually. So just pick, one person who's ready. You can just run through that, one by one, or you could do it as a whole group. So what was that like? And just hearing a few different people's experiences, and then what did we learn, or any insights around creativity when it comes to blah, blah, blah. And then hearing from everyone. And after that, doing that applied bit. So just figuring out how you want to do that in advance, and then noticing if it is the right structure for that moment, because sometimes it is really useful to drill down with one person, because that person's experience can resonate and reflect for everybody else.
Yeah.
And you can really go down deep, versus actually just like, let's take a little snapshot, which is a little bit more surface level.
Yeah. I can resonate so much with everything you're saying. If you have, and I'm talking for our listeners now, if you have experience facilitating workshops, running training courses and things like that, then everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. And now we get to the end, which is the key points that you want to land.
Yeah. So each activity, generally speaking, before you've done it, even though the learnings are going to come from the participants, you will have some idea of the key point of that. That helps you guide that debrief, the reflective conversation, and it helps you to, at the end, make sure that you're capturing those top points that you want them to have got from that activity. And here, anytime you can use the participants' own language, own words to land the key points, the better, because they'll feel invested in the process. They'll appreciate being listened to, and it feels like they'll have ownership over what's just happened. And so that's the Spark framework. And what I would say is, within the workshop, you're basically in the workshop experience arc, you're running that multiple times. So each activity you can run through Spark. So Spark, 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 Spark. And because there is that final reflective piece, the R and K at the end of each Spark, I will throw in this breaking the rule piece. You could, and I've done this, and I recommend people do it. If you've got a few activities that build on each other, you may just want to do the spara, and just hold the full reflection until the end. So you're just doing, setting the scene, providing the guidance, presenting the information, providing the guidance, activating the experience. Done. Do the next one. Do the next one. Do the next one. You may find that you'll still need in between each one to just do a little bit of ventilating, of just going, what was that like? Okay, cool. That was easy. That was hard. Great. Let's move on to the next thing. And so you could just stack the experience till the end and do a final debrief. What did we learn? How are you going to apply it?
Yeah, no, I can see that. And of course, that's a framework. But then, yes, I can see that there is an element of flexibility depending on what we are doing, what the context is, what we're trying to achieve, the types of activities that we want to include, the key points that we want to land. There's an element of flexibility. So again, to summarize for listeners, the Spark structure: you set the scene, you present information, you provide guidance, you activate the experience, you give them an opportunity to reflect on the experience, and then you land your key points. Perfect. Now, Ped, how do you go about? We've got, you said at the beginning, you don't want to wing it, you want to be prepared. And again, this is very relevant when it comes to presenting, for example, it's the same thing. At the same time, even if you are prepared, then you will have situations where there will be some challenging dynamics. You could have a difficult participant in some way. What do we need to mention? How do you go about handling challenging or difficult situations as you facilitate a workshop?
Yeah, good question. So anything we could do to mitigate. So, one of the things that we talked about last week, and I haven't said this phrase yet, but when I think about facilitating, everything that I've just shared with the storytelling approach, the Spark framework, it's about helping facilitation go right. And so I talk about facilitation by design. So we're designing our facilitative process. And so that also comes in play when it comes to managing difficult people, quote unquote, difficult people. Oftentimes there is positive intent in people being quote unquote difficult, and so we need to assume that and offer the space for it to come out more positively in the workshop. So one of the things that I would make sure we do in advance is, in preparing for the workshop, depends on the context. Let's say you're working with a client to go into a corporate setting, I would do interviews, take a sample of people who are going to come to the workshop. Again, this is resource depending if there's enough resource for this. Speak to people, understand who the different personalities are, get to know people through the samples of conversations that you're having. So you can be better prepared for what may come. And then in setting the scene in the workshop, it's, although we didn't talk about it explicitly before, but I always make sure that there's time to agree on our working agreements or working culture or designed alliance. There's lots of different terms for this phrase, but it's really about asking people what is going to make a constructive and positive experience for them, having that conversation up front, and also asking for permission to interrupt, to call out, to whatever. So I try and do as much of that as possible in advance to then, if unhelpful behavior does arise in the workshop, you can then say, hey, how are we doing with the behaviors that we said we wanted to exhibit in the workshop, etc. A great question to ask in advance when we're doing the designed alliance is, how do we want to be together, or how do we want to behave if we disagree? And that is by far the most powerful question you can ask in advance if you want to deal with people who are, like I said, quote unquote, difficult. So that's how I would do that. In terms of ripping up the plan, if things that's also another conversation to have if you want to talk about that too. But yeah, in terms of people, that's what I would do.
No, I love it. And again, it's very much connected to the approach we should follow in preparation for a presentation, more of a talk. Very, very similar. And also, Pat, you going back to some of the things you mentioned earlier, for example, you gave a very practical tip, which is first you organize the resources or the group. So again, it depends on the context, and then you give instructions. So that's a practical tip or technique. Anything else that comes to mind? And any practical things, even like simple things that we can do as facilitators that will improve the experience?
Yeah. So the I always think about, whenever I'm designing a session, whenever I'm preparing facilitating, I rehearse how I set up the instructions, how I set up an activity, and how I give the instructions. And whilst I do that, I imagine what it's like for the participants to hear me say that. And the litmus test is, am I clear enough in advance about what's going on, why they're doing it, and how the activity is going to happen? As I give the instructions, is it clear enough that this is step one without them being confused about that before I give them step two? So I'm always just literally imagining the people reacting to what I'm saying. And so being client-centered or being participant-centered is the top tip. And the other piece about that is always just going, what questions are people going to have as I explain things? So this is why the what, how, and the why is so important. Some people are going to know, why are we doing this? Some people are going to want to know, like, what are we doing? And so just covering all the bases allows us to just get the facilitation going as smoothly as possible, because I think people don't like uncertainty. At least I don't. And so whatever I can do to offer certainty at each step of the process is going to make things simple, including, and if we want to if we want to run an activity which is a bit of a mystery, so that we're not giving away too much, there are times when we want to do that. And there are still ways of setting up an activity where you say, look, we're about to do something. I'm not going to tell you much. I want you to have the experience, and then we'll talk about it afterwards, is better than going, right, everyone stand up, go over there, do this, where people are like, what's going on? Right. So whatever we can do to help people just feel comfortable that we know what we're doing, they're in good hands, and for them to trust the process is the top tip I would give.
Yeah, because there's a reason for like, why we do certain things. Okay, you also mentioned a couple of very important things also in presenting, rehearsing. And also you said
Yeah.
you imagine yourself being there. So we rehearse in in conditions which are, it doesn't have to be a physical condition. It could be a mental condition, which is as close as possible to the real conditions. And also you said that your approach is very much client or participant focused. And again, this is the number one tip in communication in general. Last week at the web class, you talked about the course of knowledge, which is I think that it's the number one problem or challenge in
Yeah.
communication. Just in case we've got some listeners who are not familiar with that, can you just spend a minute explaining
Yeah.
what this challenge is, the course of knowledge?
So the curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias where we find it really difficult to accept or understand that people don't know what we know. Even when we know they might not know something, the fact that it's so ingrained in how we know it and understand it, we underestimate the leap it takes for somebody to get it the same way that we get it. And so it might mean that we don't explain things clearly. There's hidden assumptions around the tasks that we might give, the activities we set up. I know that this is an audio podcast, but so I can't show you this, but I'll describe it. There's a really funny short video which is of a trust fall gone wrong. So there's like this person who stood on a table and has got his eyes closed, and this is the facilitators explaining this, and he goes, "Okay, so Andrea, we're all here. We're here to support you. You know, when you're ready, just just fall and we'll catch you." And one stood behind them, and the person falls forwards, right? And then the video finishes. And I think that's just such a perfect example of the curse of knowledge when it comes to giving instructions, because it's not clear which way they need to fall. Right? So
I'm
giving
finding it difficult
instructions.
not to laugh.
Yeah, I know,
You
right?
need to you need to send me that link because I'm
I'll
going to
send it to you.
include it. I'm going to include it in the show notes. And Ped, do you know the talking about the course of knowledge? Do you know the tappers and listeners story or example?
No,
Okay, so I'm going. No, normally, I never do this. I always give my guests an opportunity to speak all the time. I never
no, go for it.
step in, but this is going to be very relevant. There's in 1990 a psychology student, I think it was a Stanford University or one of those universities in the US, asked two groups of people to play a game, two groups, tappers and listeners.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
The tappers had to tap out rhythms to famous songs on a table. So think about very famous songs, but instead of singing the songs, they just had to. Do you know it?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, yeah. But please finish the
Okay, and
story.
I'm going to finish
It's
it
a
for
very good
listeners.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the listeners, they just had to try and guess the songs. By the way, this is something that I found in Made to Stick, a fantastic book by the Heath brothers, Made to Stick. And before the experiment started, the student asked the tappers to estimate how many songs they thought that the listeners would have guessed. And they estimated 50%, 50. Now, in reality, it was very different. The listeners only guessed 2.5% of the songs. Massive difference. Why? Because if you're a tapper, you have knowledge that the listeners don't have. If you're a tapper, you have the songs in your head. And so you find it very hard to understand why they can't guess them. For you, it's obvious.
Yes.
If you're a listener, you don't have that knowledge. You don't have the songs in your head. And so you do find it very hard. I
Yeah.
interviewed Dr. John Medina on this podcast. He's the author of a great book, Brain Rules. And he always says, what's obvious to you is obvious to you. And often we take it for granted that whatever it is that we are trying to communicate is also obvious to the
Yeah.
audience. And okay, stop. I need to stop here. I don't have
Yeah.
to talk too
No,
much.
no, all good. I love that anecdote. Yes.
Cool. Now, you said earlier that there's a great question you like to ask at the beginning of or before in preparation for when as you design a workshop, which is it was very much related to okay, how are we going to disagree? So something what
Yeah,
are we
yeah,
going
yeah.
to do in the disagreement? Yeah. Now, and this it doesn't have to be the answer doesn't have to be a question, but how do you go about assessing the effectiveness of a workshop of a training course after it's done?
Yeah. So again, I start. It starts before it's done. So facilitation by design. When it comes to designing the strategy for the workshop, and when I say strategy, I mean, okay, what is the overall goal that this workshop supports? What is the outcome of the workshop that then leads into this goal? And therefore, if that's the outcome, what are the objectives of the workshop? And the way I design the objectives is by using action-oriented verbs. So to create the objective by the end of this workshop, we will have created X, Y, or Z. We will have discussed X, Y, or Z. We will have whatever it is. If it's actionable, it actually helps you in the workshop to see if those actions are being taken. It also helps the individuals if you ask them, did we do this or did we not do that? Uh, determine whether to what extent they were able to 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 what extent they achieve those objectives. And if the outcome is tangible, an actual product that's created or an output, then again, was it made or not made? So that even without doing anything else, those are the things that you can determine the success of a workshop. Did plan that I had, the objectives and the outcomes transpire? Did it happen? That's where I would start. Depending on context, you may want to also create surveys, which can capture immediate sentiment. Now, surveys are great for figuring out people's reactions, did they like it or not like it, but also capturing any specific opinions around how much they were able to achieve. And I can talk about the pros and cons of using sliding scales on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, or actually what I prefer is giving people options around identifying with statements giving people statements to identify with, because it's a better indicator of people's opinions versus somebody's 4 could be somebody else's 3. It's totally subjective, right? So
On that
that's
point,
another.
Ed, on that point, this is so true. And sorry to cut you off, but for
Yeah,
example, something I notice sometimes what we do, but now I'm reflecting on our own approach. We give participants two things. One is a scale from 0 to 10. 0 means horrible experience, 10 means fantastic. And then there's just one question to give them an opportunity to tell us more about why they gave
yeah,
us their
yeah, yeah, yeah.
score. Mm.
Perfect.
But you're right. Sometimes I see there's a 7, and for me a 7, and likely it doesn't happen often. But if I see a 7, I'm not happy. Okay, let's
Yeah,
let's 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 see what happened there. And then you look at the response, and it's a fantastic response because for that person, obviously 7 is a great score. So you never know.
yeah, exactly. You never know. And so I got this from a book, which is behind me. I won't. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's to do with it's by a monitoring and evaluation expert called Will Tanner. I may have completely mispronounced his name, but he's got one question in there, which is something on the lines of, to what extent are you able to use what you have learned in this workshop or in this training or whatever to do what you need to do? And so you've got to construct, a phrase, a question that's relevant and to the context that you're working in. And then you've got a bunch of choices. I'm not able to use what I've learned at all. I am able to use what I've learned, but I will need more practice. Or I'm a complete expert at this, or whatever it is. Or there might be even a question which is, this is not relevant to my role at all. So this is, I'm giving you an example from more of a training and a training facilitation context, but you could have other things. You could have similar questions to do with other contexts. And this is far more useful to figure out how effective your training was. And in fact, if everyone says, I'm actually already an expert at this, then you know that maybe you got the positioning or the content completely wrong, and you have to actually have gone a little bit more advanced in what you're facilitating. So I find those way more useful. And then the third thing, to go back to your original question around how do you evaluate the effectiveness of a workshop? Again, this depends on the context in which you're working, the resources available, etc. But going back and checking whether people have taken action on the things they said they were going to take action. So if you're working in a corporate context, then this could be a check-in. It could be something that you might want to incorporate in your proposals, incorporate in the service to check in. You could have surveys, you could do interviews, you could, whatever it is, some sort of follow-up to determine whether the action's been taken. And of course, related to this as well is then what are the support structures that you can also put in place to make sure things happen. But in a way, those are the three things: capturing things in the workshop itself by observing, capturing things just at the end of the workshop with a survey, and then capturing things after the workshop and when time has gone by.
Makes sense. Again, very, very useful. Just a couple of other questions before we close. You mentioned a book, and I didn't understand. Do you remember what the book is, or because if not, you don't have to. As long as you give it to me later, I'm going to include it.
There we go. So it's called Performance Focused Smile Sheets, and it is by Will Thalamir.
Okay, a radical rethinking of a dangerous art form. Okay, what's the gist of the book?
So this is all about creating surveys that get you better insights around how a particular workshop training went.
Understood. And again, last week at the web class, you also recommended a few other books. If you remember some, if our listeners would like to learn more about this topic, what recommendation do you have?
We've got this book called The Workshop Survival Guide by Rob Fitzpatrick and Devon Hunt. And this is a really great way, a great breakdown of how you just go about designing workshops. It's very easy to digest. It's got, they've got a version of the 6 experience formats in here as well. So there's this book, The Secret of Facilitating by Michael Wilkinson, is very thorough, and it's like a textbook. So it's written in a way that there's lots of case studies and examples and structures, etc. And it's really useful, but it's pretty like it's like going back to school and reading a textbook. So these are really helpful when it comes to designing workshops. In terms of actual content, depending on your context, depending on the types of workshop you're designing, whether it's team development or individual development or innovation processes, there's just so many other books that
I could. Of course, it depends.
Yeah.
It depends on your area of expertise. Yeah. And is it possible that behind you I saw Mark LaRue's book?
Yes.
That's Mark's book, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Say hi. Say hi to. We'll say hi to Mark.
Hi, Mark.
And yeah, he's been
That's
on the
how
podcast.
we met.
Yeah, that's how we met.
That's how we met. Yeah.
By Mark. Yeah, and he's been on the podcast a couple of times. And okay, perfect. Now, Pat, if anybody wants to connect with you, where do they find you?
LinkedIn is where I hang out the most when it comes to being online. So my LinkedIn.com/Pedram Parasmand. It is my name. I'm the only Pedram Parasmand in the world. It's a little claim to fame. So yeah, it's that's where if you want to send me a connection request or just send me a DM, I'm happy to reply.
Okay, we're going to include it in the show notes. If you think about everything we've discussed, we looked at the art and science of facilitation. We talked about many things. We went through the key mistakes, a storytelling approach, a Spark framework. We talked about handling challenging dynamics and like techniques and tips, how to assess the effectiveness of a workshop. We looked at many, many things. What's the most important thing? What's the one thing you would like our listeners to take away from this conversation?
That great facilitation doesn't just happen, it's intentional and it's designed.
Great facilitation doesn't just happen, it's intentional, it's designed. And again, the same is true when it comes to presenting, public speaking. And perfect, Pat. Thank you so much. This has been really helpful. I'm going to go back to your web class last week. As I said, I'm also going to go back to this conversation because there are a few things that I need to apply in my own facilitation. So thank you for your time, for your generosity, for sharing your insights. And let's keep in touch. See you soon.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.